Welcome to the Warships Podcast with your host, Kelorn, and Aerroon.
Hello and welcome to episode 133 of the Warships Podcast. I'm your host, Kelorn, and I'm back from my trip last weekend. I'm joined by Aerroon this week, as Vanessa is unable to join us this week with some family in town visiting. Thanks again, Aerroon, for the great job you guys did last week. I really appreciate you guys having a great episode.
Well, I don't know about great. I hope it was acceptable.
I heard several people giving you guys compliments, so I think that you guys did just fine. I actually had a great time at Lake Tahoe. For those of you who don't know, I've been studying Aikido for the last 6 years, and back in 2016, I spent 2 weeks as uchideshi in Japan, living and serving a dojo that was actually the founder of Aikido's dojo, before he passed away in the 1960s. And the sensei that I learned from there and who had actually invited me to be there who was coming out to California to a seminar at Lake Tahoe. And so that was why I was out last weekend, as I was at that seminar learning from him. So it's been a long journey, and it's really cool to get to see him again and make connections with people that I've gotten to know doing Aikido over the years. I also snuck in a quick visit to my brother and his wife, who have recently moved to Reno. So had a pretty good weekend.
That actually sounds really amazing. Like, really amazing.
It's been quite a journey. I mean, it's one of those things where when you do a martial art and you stick with it for a long time, it's kind of it's hard to explain. You know, the only things that I've done in my life that have lasted longer were things like school, like going to college or going to primary school and things like that. So doing something for so long, it's really becomes a part of who you are.
Well, you've been doing a podcast for a while now. But what I mean by how amazing it is, that actually sounds like it's something straight out of a movie. Like, that's something I didn't expect people did.
Not a lot of people choose to do it. I will say that when I was there for 2 weeks, the first week was okay. The second week, I kind of lost my mind. It was really mentally taxing when you're, spending the entire day in working and being in pain, and it was quite interesting. But all of that said, this week we start out with a quick announcement. SubOctavian is visiting from Wargaming North America. We're visiting the Wargaming North America office here in Austin. And to celebrate, Wargaming is hosting an impromptu player gathering on Saturday, June 1st at the Pour House in Austin, Texas at 2 p.m. All ages are welcome, but you, of course, must be 21 to imbibe of that sweet, sweet alcohol. I will be attending, so if you stop by, look for me and get a podcast sticker. Check the link in the episode description to register, as there is limited availability. So it's really cool that they have these player gatherings where you can get together, meet the community staff here in Austin, meet SubOctavian, who's in town from Russia, who you and I have interacted with a multitude of times, Aerroon, but normal players don't get to meet him.
Yep, and he's a really, really, really nice guy, and I do recommend having a chat with him if you can.
Yeah, he's always open to hearing perspective from players. He's actually really good at being able to sort individual opinions from what the overall opinion of the entire player base is. They spend a lot of time not just taking in this. You hear a lot of times that the squeaky wheel gets the grease. Well, Wargaming does, think about the squeaky wheel, but they also think about the kind of the silent majority as well.
Yeah, who is often the much more important part, because when people think everything is great, they're not going to complain, right? So you're not going to hear about them. But if you change things, things go out of control and rather quickly. So it's probably very important to make sure that they don't upset the silent majority.
Agreed. And speaking of the silent majority, patch 0.8.4 was released this week with the release of Soviet battleships, carrier adjustments, and ranked battles. We'll be covering ranked battles, the new map, and the revised map in their own sections in just a minute. So for now, let's concentrate on the game changes, updates, and the like. First up, plane boost speed and decelerating speed has been normalized across all carriers, with a few exceptions. Boost speed is now 35 knots for all bomber aircraft and 40 knots for Japanese and Graf Zeppelin bombers, as well as all attack aircraft from all nations. Those would be the rocket planes for those of you unfamiliar with that terminology. Similarly, planes will decelerate by 17.5 knots or 20 knots for IJN, Graf Zeppelin, and all attack aircraft again. Second, the reticle shape, bomb dispersion, and drop altitude has been changed for dive bombers, and this is intended as a buff for destroyers, making it a little harder for you to land multiple bomb hits on a relatively small target. Third, Graf Zeppelin's dive bombers have gotten a buff, increasing their armor penetration, giving them more attack time, increasing bomb speed, and slightly reducing the reticle size. Finally, there's a host of small changes and bug fixes, as is normal for most of these patches, like the names of IJN ships getting their diacritical marks for long vowel sounds, like Fuso, and Yamato getting improved armor protection, improved torpedo protection after problems were found with her recent remodel. Taking it as a whole, I feel like 0.8.4 is a step in the right direction, particularly for carriers. But the question I have for you, Aerroon, is it enough?
Nope, no way. I played CVs after the patch on the NA server, and sure, I felt some annoyance with some of the mechanics, but that was stuff that was there before. Maybe there is a numerical difference between what we had before and now, but I don't think the change is anything too significant. Like, sure, CVs are weaker now, but they're still gonna ruin the day of a destroyer, and there is very little the destroyer can do about it.
Can you explain a little bit more about what you mean by that, Aerroon? Is it more to do with the fact that the destroyer is being spotted and shot by other things, or is it more to do with the actual direct damage from the carrier onto that destroyer?
Well, it's still both. Sure, you're not gonna get multiple bomb hits, but even a single bomb hit on a DD can often mean 20% of your HP gone, and the only real way to avoid that is to use your smoke screens and all those things. And then, of course, there will be other ships shooting you at the same time, and none of this affects rocket planes, for example, from what I understand, who can still go and do like, oh, I just hit your Shimakazu for 5k damage. And then I turn around and I come around and I deal 7k damage. And then I turn around and I deal another some kind of damage. That's, even if you get lucky in such a situation and the ship doesn't deal that much damage, you're still taking like 5 to 10k damage, and that's almost half your HP. That's a really bad thing that can happen to a DD. And I think DDs just play differently as a result, meaning that they don't go into caps. Before, people would get annoyed by this, but now, you can't really blame the destroyer for not wanting to be forward because they'll just die.
Well, I have some more questions for you regarding that when we get to the ranked section in a minute. But one of the things that I found is that repeated attack element is really the part that feels broken. Like, even in a battleship, you get torpedoed and then they go around and they torpedo you again, and then they go around and then they torpedo you again. And, if two of those flood, you're pretty well hosed.
Well, sure, but that's kind of rare. The torpedoes don't flood that often. I don't actually mind that part as much. I only mind it on destroyers, kind of. I think the much bigger problem is not that the CV will fly and attack you and fly around and do the same attack run again. I think a much bigger problem is that if you are a prime target for a CV at the time, meaning that the CV attacks you, it is very likely that you are in a position where you are the best or one of the best targets for the CV to attack. And it takes a while to reposition as a ship in this game, meaning that if you are likely to be the best target of attack right now, you're going to be the best target of attack 2 minutes from now when the CV, does its attack run on you, all of the attack runs, then, flies back, starts another plane squadron. It's likely that the CV will come and attack you again, because you are still the best target. It takes too long for you to, duck behind cover, so to say, basically get into the umbrella of a strong anti-air ship. And this, in my opinion, is my biggest gripe with the CV. Actually, this isn't really even rework related, because the only difference here is that the planes will get back to you quicker. But this same thing happened with RTS CVs, where a CV would simply just strike you over and over if you are a good target. It just happens more quickly now. And that's in my opinion one of the big issues that CVs have always had with this game, from the perspective of a non-CV player or from the perspective of the receiving end. Because if you're on the receiving end, you see planes, okay, they did 20k damage to you as a battleship. That's pretty bad, but you can live with it. But then 30 seconds to a minute later, they come again and they deal another 20 to 30k damage, and then again and again and again, and then you're eventually dead. The only real chance there is that maybe you were close enough to an anti-airship that you weren't going to be attacked, but the chance of that isn't always very high, and often it's not up to you to decide, because if you're slower than an anti-airship or the anti-airships just go into a different direction, you can't do anything about it, and you basically just die. So the only option there is that the CV just decides to attack somebody else, which often happens, but it doesn't always happen, and when it doesn't, it's just incredibly frustrating to play against, and that's regardless of ship class.
You know, a lot of that has to deal with random battles and the nature of playing by yourself on a team on a team game, which is a perfect segue into the fact that a new season of ranked battles is starting at tier 10, and it's got 17 ranks and no Super League. You know, when with much controversy, carriers will be permitted in this new season of ranked, drastically changing the battles of power. Rewards are pretty typical for a ranked season, with a total of 5,500 steel and a myriad of flags and other consumables being up for grabs. One thing that did catch my eye was the inclusion of Epicenter on tiers of the player base. I mean, tiers of the desert. This game mode is fairly widely panned in my experience in standard battles, and it will be really interesting to me to see how it shapes up for ranked battles. Finally, after much success with the rental ships and clan battles, this is the first season we see rental ships in ranked. So if you play a random or a co-op battle with a tier 8 or higher ships, you'll get a rental of the same type. So I guess everyone, the central part of this season to me isn't the ranked ships, because I think the ranked ships are going to be a decent idea, and I think you're going to see them more in the lower tiers, and then as you get to the higher tiers, they're going to mostly disappear, which is more or less what happens in clan battles. At the same time, though, carriers are the issue. So is the issues that you were just talking about, where, you know, you're by yourself and you get focused, is that still going to be a big issue in ranked battles, or do you expect that the team environment is going to push ships closer together and make that carrier's job a little harder?
Well, I think it is what you mentioned at the end there. I do think that what's going to happen is that ships are going to stick really close together, and they're going to be very anti-air focused. And as a result, carriers are going to have a lot of trouble finding easy targets. However, it's a different type of gameplay, because essentially it means that both teams are just going to blob up, and then they'll have a blob versus blob fight. This means that there's not going to be much flanking. There's not going to be much like, oh, I'm going to go contest both, where our team is going to contest both cap zones. Stuff like that isn't just going to happen because the CV is too much of a threat. The other thing is that ships that go full anti-air are going to be a lot weaker when you end up in a match that doesn't have a CV. And so it's going to be different. From what I've heard so far out of ranked battles, I haven't played any myself yet, it seems that there's a huge lack of destroyers. So often you'll get like cruisers and battleships capping all at the same time, which might lead to some interesting gameplay. But again, they're probably going to try to stick mostly together, meaning that it's not going to be very fun for the CV, obviously, because the CV is going to have to fight the wall of anti-air. But it's also not going to be as much fun for any of the other ships, because they'll just have to stick together. Otherwise, the CV just picks them apart. And I think people aren't going to enjoy this ranked season as much as, well, I don't want to say the last one, because I think they definitely wouldn't be enjoying it as much as the last one, because it's not fully arms race. But I think they're going to enjoy it less than even the one before that, because I think blobbing up is just not a fun way to play the game.
But I guess the other thing is it going to change the team compositions that we are typically seeing? I mean, we used to see maybe not a heavy reliance on destroyers, but I mean, you could see, half the team being destroyers was not an uncommon thing in ranked, just because of how important, it was to get those caps and things like that. Even in the arms race mode, it was, getting the, those circles, and using the destroyers to do that, could be critically important. But I guess the question really for me is just like, how are we going to cap in an environment where carriers have impunity to strike destroyers that aren't under AA umbrellas?
Well, I mean, smoke helps there, but I don't know if smoke is good enough. And again, from what I've heard, destroyers have been a rarity, or at least have been more rare than people are used to. And I mean, we see the same thing in random battles, so it kind of makes sense. I don't really know how much destroyers have dropped off in random battles because, there's variants. Sometimes you do still get quite many destroyers in a single game. But I think in ranked, as you might get into higher ranks, unless for some reason CVs become unpopular at the higher ranks, which I don't think is going to happen, but obviously there's a chance, because that's what has happened in the past every other time, because CVs are always going to be a mirror, meaning that you might end up having to queue for too long of a time. And if it drops like below some kind of a threshold, CV players might just not want to queue, especially if you play like late at night. So it's possible that in those cases, the type of gameplay that appears is going to be completely different from the stuff we get at the start. But I think that it's likely that we'll just see less destroyers. And I think cruisers are going to just fulfill the same type of role, maybe like Minotaur, for example, because she's fairly stealthy, and she also has a smoke screen. But on top of that, her anti-air just shreds planes, or I think it still shreds planes, right? Because I haven't actually checked after the rework, at least
it shreds
depth.
them. Yeah.
Oh,
not as ridiculously as it used to, but I mean, it's still not anything that you want to be around.
Yeah, so I think cruisers like that might end up being the capping force, or it might very well end up being that because you're moving in a blob anyway, that you just move into the cap as a blob. And I think that one might actually be the easiest strategy to execute, as long as people are on the same page with it.
Well, I mean, the flip side of it is, the counter to a blob is a torpedo destroyer, and yet a torpedo destroyer, is disempowered and disinclined to play because of the carriers. So the carrier is now inadvertently making cruisers and battleships more preferable, and the tactics of blobbing up more preferable.
Yeah, I mean, I think I think it makes a lot of sense to play in a blob like that. In fact, in many types, as long as you can move the blob around, I think actually fighting in a blob is a very, very good idea in general, because you can focus fire much more easily like that. And on top of that, it's possible to support one another with something like smoke screens, for example, and hydro, which should keep you somewhat safe. But the biggest issue usually with blobs is the fact that they just get bogged down, because well, actually, I don't know why specifically. I expect there's some kind of a traffic type of reason for it, where if some ships slow down, it has an impact on what the rest of them do. Because if you look at random battles, blobs aren't necessarily bad. It's just that when you see a blob going somewhere, they are just stuck in that position for forever, and you just lose the game elsewhere because they never leave where they are.
I mean, realistically, we call it blob tactics, but I mean, real fleet tactics are a large group of ships working together and moving in unison. So, I mean, is this making the game more realistic, or do you think that that's just a unintended consequence?
Well, I do think it is, in that sense, somewhat more realistic, because that is, like you mentioned, that is how fleets work. However, I think it just doesn't lead to gameplay that's as much fun, because, when ships spread out, you end up in these maybe not 1 versus 1s, but like 2 versus 2s or 3 versus 3s. And you can like keep in mind like where all the ships are and what you're engaging with and what you are being engaged by. However, if you have like a 7 versus 7, then it could end up being in a situation where you're like, okay, so those ships already fired. Now I'm fine to show broadside to drop my torpedoes, or I don't know, fire all of my guns or something like that. But if it's a 7 versus 7, that's not going to happen, or it's less likely to happen, because it might be that when you show broadside, one of the other 4 ships will go like, oh, I'm going to shoot you because you're showing me broadside right now. or something along those lines. And so I think it's less fun to fight. You end up with these basically standoffs where battleships just slowly reverse away from one another and keep shooting each other. I mean, that's something we've seen in ranked before, plenty. So it's not like people
The smoke
don't know this
blobs?
type of strategy. Yeah, exactly. And not necessarily even the smoke ones. It's, you see battleships just face one another and then just slowly reverse away while shooting. And we all know this type of gameplay, so I think it'll come pretty naturally to many players.
So I guess we don't really have time to cover every single ship that you could possibly play in this ranked season. But Aerroon, could you give a couple of recommendations for each class about ships that you think will be effective in this particular environment?
Well, anything that has anti-air would be pretty good, but I guess I can start with a battleship. I would still go with Yamato because of the overmatch mechanics and the fact that she's pretty good at long range, although it seems that since Kremlin is now available, she is also incredibly powerful. So I am unsure how Kremlin would match up to Yamato in this sense. So I would say Yamato, but maybe Kremlin is also very good. In terms of cruisers, well, anything that has good anti-air. However, I think, as usual, something like a Stalingrad or a Moskva, or I guess any kind of those super cruisers would be pretty useful because, they can fulfill a similar role to a battleship, especially the Stalingrad, meaning that you should have some flexibility in your matches, especially if there are no destroyers. Super cruisers kind of are afraid of destroyers because they don't have like great torpedo belts, and many of them, or any of them, don't have Hydra, I think. And so they don't have to worry as much about torpedoes. As far as destroyers are concerned, I'm not sure. Maybe you can play a destroyer as normal. Maybe an entire destroyer would help. But personally, if I were to play a destroyer, I would probably play something like a Harugumo and go like full range upgrade or a lot of range upgrade stuff. Just so that if I end up in a situation where I'm like, okay, I can't push because, if I go forward, the CV will just kill me, I can simply sit back somewhere near where the rest of the ships are and keep shelling. And Harugumo is fairly effective at it because she puts out a lot of damage. And as for CVs, I think it's still Midway. But if there are too many, because Midway's dive bombers are insane, they deal like the same amount of damage as AP dive bombers, except they set fires and they deal damage to light targets. Plus, Midway has the Tiny Tims, which are basically mini dive bombers in and of themselves. You can hit battleships, cruisers, anything with them, and they will deal quite a lot of damage. The torpedoes kind of suck, though. On the other hand, though, if blobs are a big deal, maybe Hakuryu is actually better, because Hakuryu can do somewhat long-range torpedoes, so, if it's a big blob, you can drop long-range torpedoes, and that will either make the blob move, or you'll hit and deal some damage. And so, I can't really tell which one of the CVs would be better, because you're not fighting one another, so it's not as important that, or it's not as clear as it used to be that one CV is better because it has better fighter power.
Yeah, for me, I on the battleship side of things, I largely agree. I think Yamato is still a really good choice. Though I do think that something like a Montana or a Grosse Kurfürst, with their their AA power and the lack of any real torpedo threat could be pretty effective. Those are big ships that don't have a lot of maneuverability, but I mean, the AA power on the Kurfürst and on the Montana really isn't anything to sneeze at. And the secondaries on Kurfürst can be very effective against cruisers, and if you're going to be in a big blob, why not? If you're talking about blob ships, Kurfürsts are really, really good at blob tactics. On the cruiser side of things, I think I would default to something more along the lines of, the Minotaur, the Worcester, and the Des Moines. Personally, I think that those ships are particularly if you are good at playing those ships, they can be, have effect on the match that kind of outstrips their hit point totals. The kind of the safer choices are, those super cruisers, the Stalingrad and whatnot. But even there, I think I would still default towards, some of the light cruisers and the heavy cruisers with the high rates of fire. I would not take a Hindenburg, and I probably would not take an Henri, because an Henri by itself, which is where, or an Henri and Zhao by themselves, which is where they like to be flanking, that's just a recipe for death to a carrier. On the destroyer side of things, I think that I would stick with the AA destroyers. I think Gearing and Grozovoy in particular are going to be effective at being able to hold caps and use their smoke to kind of sit there and drive planes away long enough for them to get the cap and then scurry back to their AA umbrellas. On the other hand, I think that you're right. The Harugumo can do a lot of that thing, even though it's not technically, quote, an AA destroyer, unquote, in the game, regardless of what those ships were actually built for in real life. But for now, I do think that the Gearing and the Grozovoy will end up being effective ships for ranked. Carrier wise, I honestly, guys, I have not been playing the tier 10 carriers. I have the tier 8 premiums, and I suck at them. So I haven't really even bothered to try and grind out to the tier 10s, which I didn't have beforehand. But I do think that both of them will be effective. The Midway is, of course, the Midway, but I think that, the torpedo spam method off of Hakuryu, could be very effective, Aerroon, at breaking up those blobs when you don't have you don't have DDs to throw torpedoes at them. So
that's true. Do you think there will be any 20-kilometer Shimakaze players?
I would be very surprised to see 20-kilometer Shimakaze players, because honestly, the Shimakaze isn't fast enough to outrun planes. And even though its torps aren't going to be spotted by those planes, once the Shimakaze is kind of located, it becomes a lot easier to deal with her torps.
No. The Shimakaze is sitting next to the, sitting next to the Worcester, okay? And just launching the torpedoes from far away. And then the planes can't hurt her, right? That's the most important part?
If you say so. I don't, if you're talking jokingly, that's fine. I think, from an effectiveness standpoint, Shimakaze is not a good choice.
Yeah, I agree. Shimakaze, especially with 20-kilometer torpedoes, would not be a good choice. But there's always the chance that you'll accidentally hit the enemy carrier at the back.
That would be entertaining. Though, the carriers at tier 10 just have so many hit points that even if they're lit up and your battleship salvo shots at them, you're unlikely to kill them, because they have so much armor and they have so many hit points that even if you get a really devastating strike, it's unlikely that that you're going to kill them.
Well, to be fair, I don't think it's even the hit points or even the armor. I guess the armor does play a big part. It's the fact that damage over time doesn't work. Like, you set the CV on fire and she's on fire for what, 5 or 10 seconds? That's like nothing. And then the deck is like, the entire deck is armored, so all of your shells always shatter when you're firing HE, and AP just bounces. That can be very difficult to take down from my experience, especially with something like a destroyer or a cruiser. And so I actually feel like that they should either nerf CV survivability, like make damage over time deal significant damage again, or maybe they should put like a maximum flying range on the CVs and, I don't know, give them like battleship bows and send those CVs into battle.
Battle carrier engage.
Yes, exactly.
Alrighty, well, did you have any last thoughts on the ranked situation before we move on? Next week, I think we'll probably have played some ranked battles and can have a better opinion of kind of where we're at with ranked.
Well, not really. I pretty much said what I already thought. Alrighty.
Well, we have a new map and a map that has been slightly reworked. So we'll start with the new map. And the new map that's been added to the rotation is called Greece. Based on the Adriatic Sea, it offers a 4-cap format in random battles and a 3-cap format in ranked battles. The center of the map is pretty intensely covered in islands and will be difficult for the heavier ships to penetrate from one side of the map to the other side. I guess, have you gotten to see this map in action yet, Aaron? Because I have not. And did you have any impressions if you did?
I did in fact play this map. In fact, I played it as a CV, so I didn't really see that much of the map. I thought, as far as we fought, it was fairly standard. Like, it didn't feel kind of out of place, but maybe there are some things that we haven't figured out how to, specifically abuse yet. But I found that it was just fairly standard. It didn't feel like it specifically gave an advantage to one side, and it didn't feel like basically it felt balanced. And
I guess my question
seem anything special.
More for you, Aerroon, is did the teams seem stuck on their own sides and just kind of exchanging fire? Or was one team able to successfully push from their side to the other side?
Unfortunately, I can't answer this question because, you see, I was in a midway and I sailed through the middle of the map. So, there were other ships that did the same thing. So I think that might have been like an exception type of gameplay. So it's difficult for me to tell whether ships would sail normally through that or not. But it did seem to me that it was entirely possible to push onto the other side's map, because there are so many different gaps and you can just very easily get there, that I think it's entirely possible. One thing I did notice, though, is that if you look at the map, you can see these islands at the back on, like, the, for example, the 2 line or the, I don't actually know which ones are the characters and which ones are the numbers, but basically the islands at the back near the spawns of ships. What I did notice is that some ships were able to actually disengage while we pushed through, and then they just became like a perpetual nuisance because, we didn't have enough ships anymore that had pushed through that could deal with them, because ships had moved on, like, to the middle of the map more and, towards where the rest of the enemies were. And essentially we ended up being flanked by those ships, and that was fairly interesting. And those islands were fairly useful at, in helping a ship do that. But I don't know, the map just didn't feel very, like, it just felt like most of the other maps, which I suppose is a good thing.
Yeah, I just, when I look at it and having not played it, it looks so intimidating to try and flank, or intimidating to try and, get your heavy push through. It looks like there is a little bit more area on the east side of the map, but still it's definitely, it looks like it's going to feel different than some of the other maps that we have that are a little bit more wide open.
Actually, even though the east side looks more open, and it is, I think a lot of pushes, at least we pushed through on the west side, and I think a lot of pushes are going to happen there, because the gaps that you go through are in the middle of the cap zone, meaning that ships are already going to be very near that those gaps themselves, because there's islands in the middle there, and so you can contest the cap while being next to an island or near an island, meaning that even if you might not always be safe from the enemy ship shells, you'll at least be safe from torpedoes. And then if you start winning on that side, you might start pushing through, and then other ships might follow. And that's why I think that people might actually end up pushing on the western side quite often as well.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think that this tactically will end up being an interesting map the more that people play it. But we also had a map that was slightly reworked, and that was Trap, which shifted all of the islands in the map from the northeast to the northeast slightly. And this kind of decreases the empty space that was a big part of the northeast corner of the map, and increases the space around the A cap, which felt pretty cramped up against the boundaries of the map. I think that both of these aspects will have a significant impact on how this map is played. And with fewer ships choosing that kind of northern route that kind of goes along the outside of the northern island, which was a pretty common tactic that you saw. Now it's a lot more difficult to get to that area from where you're and you have, once you're there, you have a lot less room to maneuver. Whereas down on the A cap, you can flank that A cap and not reveal yourself, and be outside of it, and have a little more room to play with.
Well, this is something I have complained about before. What bothered me was precisely what you mentioned at the end there. The flanking around the A-cap, that just seemed really annoying to me that you really couldn't do that. And now we can, which makes me quite happy. And I'm also happy that there isn't so much empty space at the top anymore, because people seem to get lost behind the islands over there. And that wasn't very good for either team. Wasn't fun to play against, at least.
No, and I've always felt that the southwest side of this map is the more important side of the map. If you can control the A cap and control the kind of the smaller islands in the B cap, I think that's a stronger play than trying to place BC on this map. So I feel like that this change kind of emphasizes the importance of the A and B cap and kind of de-emphasizes the C cap a little bit.
Perhaps. I suppose, yeah, maybe. Yeah, I also agree, though, that it is easier to push from the A side into B. So so once you take over A, you can much more easily try and push into B, and rather than do it the other way around. I think it's much more difficult to push from C into B because of the big islands that are right around the B cap towards the C side, because the other islands are small.
I guess, I come at this as a bit of a battleship player and kind of a cruiser player, a heavy cruiser player. So, the A cap has always been more appealing to me as a battleship, as it gives me more options. Whereas in the C cap, I'm often forced into, lanes that can be filled with torpedoes, or forced to the outside and northern edge of the map where I have a hard time being effective. So, the A side, you can kind of hug those islands that are on the corners of the map and still have a way to project your power into the center of the map. Yet you still have options to disengage to the south or to the west, depending on which cap you're coming in from. With that said, we've received a host of new test ships to try out and report on, none of which that I've actually gotten to play because I've been so busy after coming back from my trip this week. And that list includes some new ships, which are Sirocco, Le Fantastic, Hill, Smolensk, Summers, and Colbert. And then we have updated ships that we've tested previously that they've updated their settings, which are Mogador, Yudachi, Benham, Yoshino, and Slava. So I guess, have you tried any of these yet, Aerroon? I mean, next week we're obviously going to spend more time talking about them in a little more detail, as we've had more time to spend with them. But, have you taken any of these out for a spin yet?
I have played the Colbert, the Summers, the Le Fantasque, and I have to say, though, that I think my Colbert was kind of broken. Like, maybe she's bugged or something. So Colbert is the new work-in-progress French cruiser, a light cruiser. She basically has Atlanta guns, 127 millimeters, and she has 16 of them, I believe. But the thing is that why I think she's broken. Well, my Colbert doesn't have torpedoes, which is weird because all the other French cruisers have torpedoes. And then my Colbert doesn't have a reload booster either, which is also weird because all the other French cruisers have a reload booster. So I'm really confused. I mean, sure, I can understand that, this is like a mega Atlanta and you probably don't want to give it reload booster, but come on, man. I just want to fire some more guns that aren't nearly as effective at tier 10. But joking aside, the Colbert is, you can play it in a very memey way, which is just pick full range, go range upgrade, and then pick AFT because you're dealing with 127mm guns. And this means that you get up to 21 kilometer range. And when I say that you're basically playing an Atlanta, I mean that quite literally. Your shells take over 26 seconds to get there, which means that you're basically never going to hit the actual targets. Maybe if a battleship is reversing, you might hit her. But if they use WASD even a little bit, even while reversing, you'll probably still miss. However, because she has insanely quick reload, and she has so many guns, you don't actually probably won't just double click to fire every time, because you'll just double click way too much. You'll just hold the button down, and then it makes a really nice rainbow arc.
So the words "daka daka 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 daka" mean anything to you?
Yes, and I would say that this ship is the personification of that ideal, because she fires so many shells.
So is there a gap between the last gun firing and then the first gun firing again when you just hold the button down?
There is, but it's ever so slight, and I'm sure with enough adrenaline rush, it's gonna be fine.
So with the adrenaline rush, will you actually fire less if you hold down the button?
I don't actually know that. Probably not, though.
That's interesting. I mean, you have to think about how much actual reload that you would have to get to that point where you're actually you would be disinclined to use that.
Sure, I just don't think that's ever going to be a big problem. So the reason why I say the build is very memey is because, I played the game like that. It was a 10-minute game. I fired 1,148 shells. I hit 76 of them. so your main 20 kilometers is not recommended.
Your main battery hit rate dropped 3% overall.
Yep, pretty much. That wasn't very good.
You think? Good Lord.
Yeah.
What about any of the other ones?
Actually, let's talk some more. If you play it like normally, she has 15.5 kilometer range, which is still a lot of range, but it's plenty for the ship, and she can end up being very dangerous. Now, now you might actually still take something like AFT on her, because you'll have that nice 18 kilometer range, and the reason why it's nice is because you can shoot over crazy mountains, really crazy mountains. Mountains you usually consider, oh yeah, this is a solid wall, no shell will ever come through this or over this. And then you see that little Colbert firing, and it just starts raining shells, and it never ends. And one thing I noticed, though, is that if you actually fire, in random battles with that ship, even if you don't hit anything, it makes everybody run away. I see enemies coming in, battleships and whatnot, and I start firing, and every single one turns away, and they just leave the cap and whatnot. And I thought that was very neat. I wonder if this is going to stick even after people get familiar with the ship, because the ship isn't much of a threat from that kind of a range. However, in terms of the other ships, Summers is basically, at least this is how other people described it, and I kind of agree, is basically a slightly worse gearing in most aspects, except she has better torpedoes. Everything else is either the same, slightly worse, or maybe slightly better, but the torpedoes are quite a bit better, because they're basically gearing torpedoes, but they reload faster, and that is already pretty good. Oh, and she has 3 sets of them, and they fire 4 torps per set.
So, question.
Meaning that
torpedo acceleration, yay or nay? Because this is always I run into 2 types of gearing players: those that use the torpedo acceleration, and those that want the 16.5 kilometer torps.
Yes. So the answer is depends. So if you're like me that likes playing 20 kilometer Shimakaze with the 2.5 kilometer concealment on the torpedoes, well, obviously you might not want to take concealment or torpedo acceleration. However, I would say that the gearing torpedoes are stealthy enough that torpedo acceleration will make a difference, because people are going to get hit by those torpedoes that are actually trying to avoid them, unlike Shimakaze torps, where the 20 kilometer torpedoes are only ever going to hit when somebody either isn't paying attention or they're in a position where it's impossible for them to avoid it.
Or they're certain that it's going to run out before it gets to them.
Yeah, true.
Because I've been in that position.
Yeah, true. I have also been in that position. However, on the Summers, or gearing, I suppose, the torpedoes are stealthy enough that even if you try to avoid them, you can't always, because 1.4 kilometer concealment and the torps are 66 knots, meaning that if you put torpedo acceleration on them, they're 71 knots, and that's already fast enough with that kind of concealment that it's difficult to avoid. And so I would actually recommend Concealment Expert, Torpedo Acceleration on them. And I mean, 13.2 kilometers, in my opinion, is just good enough. Actually, I think she might. I don't know about the DPM on the guns, but she does have more guns than the gearing. But I think the reload is longer. Yeah, pretty sure it is longer. So she's probably not quite as good as a gunboat as a gearing.
Well, you've got a higher alpha damage, which that's not anything to sneer at, really, when you're talking about destroyer fights. Because if you can get that first shot in, sometimes that can be decisive.
That's true. But there is one thing why the Summers is terrible right now, and that is the anti-air. She doesn't have any, or technically she does, but her anti-air is basically what Udachi has.
She doesn't have dual-purpose guns?
Nope. Her entire anti-air set consists of two 12.7 millimeter Brownings and 8 28 millimeter anti-air guns. That's it.
That's
nothing
really
else.
Terrible.
Her entire group of guns is classified by only one short-range anti-air, which is up to 1.8 kilometers and deals 68 DPS.
That's like tier 4, tier 5 AA.
I think tier 5 is overstating it.
Alrighty. Well, as usual, we have questions of the week. This week we have 2. First up from Wild Lee Coyote on the forums, who asks, with Georgia, Massachusetts, and the German battleship lines, what do you think of adding a secondary booster consumable to the game? There is some flexibility with a secondary consumable that can be tailored to the countries. For instance, give the US a 20% buff to secondary range. The Germans could get a 20% buff to secondary reloads. Russians or some other country could get a 20% buff to accuracy. Would it promote more aggression as well as give a tool for national flavor within the game? As secondaries tend to be more situational than other enhancements, so it's not like that's going to make these ships grossly overpowered.
I don't understand why this hasn't been in the game for the last many years now, because especially with the focus on secondaries, I think it makes a lot of sense to add something like that into the game, because secondaries are a fun part of the game, and so giving it boosts here and there is going to make those people who really enjoy it, have a lot more fun. And here's a question. How often are you frustrated because you were hit by enemy secondaries? I would say it's very, very, very rarely in the game. Like, very rarely do I think, oh my god, those secondaries are just bullshit. I don't want to play this anymore because of those secondaries. It just doesn't happen. It's always something else instead. The secondaries are always like, wow, that's really cool. It makes the game look fun, because even if you're being shelled at, it just is nice because you have a massive volume of fire. So I am wholeheartedly in support of secondary consumables on battleships, especially because they don't have that many buttons to press in the first place.
I actually think that Wild Lee Coyote's idea is a really good one as well. I think that it could give German battleships quite a bit of flavor. I mean, I think you might have to leave it to like tier 8 and up, maybe tier 7 and up, where that manual fire control for secondaries actually makes a difference. But yeah, I think that it could be a really cool option. I think it could be a cool option if you put it, I don't know if you would, on some ships you might have to like choose between things, like maybe on the German battleships you have to choose between hydro and the secondary boost consumable. I think that could lead to some pretty interesting choices that you have to make in how you build out your ship.
Yep, completely agreed.
So secondly, we have a more in-depth question, which was messaged to me on the forums, but the author would like to remain anonymous for reasons that he doesn't that will become apparent when I read the question. So this person asks, I'd like to be in a semi or competitive clan. Over the last year, I've been in a clan and I have improved to be somewhat of an average player. Sadly, that puts me into the top-ish of our clan. I've tried to bring better players in so that we can learn things, but to no avail, as few good players want to go to a clan that struggles and Gale lead or who has such average stats. I never cared about stats until now, as to move to a decent clan, you need stats. Now I've started to struggle to stat pad and will take some time to improve. To the point that I don't want to division with most people in my clan because they're not good enough to help me pad my stats. I like the people and I have a hard time deciding to leave. Everyone hates losing, but I don't think most are committed to actually winning. So my question is, when do you know that it's time to change clans? Even though a clan has 40 players, we struggle to get a full squad going in clan battles during the week, but what ends up happening is usually I wait around to see if we can get enough. If we don't, I start to play randoms, but it hardly fails that during a random match, enough people log on to start a clan battle, leaving me out and frustrated. I've read that the top clans have scheduled players and standbys. Is this true, or are most clans you know of fill as you go? For what it's worth, our clan is newish and improving slowly, and I think that the 8.0 rework caused a lot of turnover in a lot of clans, so we had to reset to be able to do things.
Well, I think you should go first on this one, since you have a lot more experience on this front.
Yeah, that's a good point. So I've been in a number of clans or over the years of playing this game, and in my first clan, I was one of the better players, as you kind of seem to be in your clan. And what I found is that I was unable to get better when I was the best person around. I didn't have examples to see how to play better. It's a lot harder to learn how to play better from watching videos and things like that. It's a lot easier to get better when you're playing with people who are better than you are. So, I ended up moving clans to another one that had a lot of very good players in it, where I was actually one of the worst players in the clan. And that pushed me into being a better player. And, I had come to the decision that was what I wanted to do, is that I wanted to get better. And it's a little bit of a selfish kind of decision, where I was deciding what I wanted to do was more important than making my clan better. So in that sense, you kind of have to make up your mind about what's important to you. Would you rather play with your friends, or do you really want to get better and try and be more competitive? As you get into more competitive clans, there is a lot of downsides to that as well. When they are competitive, there's a lot of stress in you need to improve, rather than, kind of taking it easy day by day. Now, once you get into the top clans, they will have A teams and B teams, and, players that are, chosen first, and, people that they bring on, to get wins, so that everybody gets their wins and stuff like that. For the most part, a lot of times, particularly during the weekdays, it's, whoever shows up first gets picked first, and then, they'll swap about halfway through clan battles, or swap when somebody has to go, or things like that. So, you just kind of have to talk to any clan that you're expecting to join and see how they do things. And, are you okay with how they do things? I've recently switched clans again to something that's not universally considered to be like a top tier clan, but it's been really nice because it was a lot less stress this clan battle season than in previous ones. So now I feel like I'm in an environment where I don't need to be this hyper competitive anymore, and I can just kind of have fun and relax and play with some friends. And yet we're still good enough that we win a good chunk of the time. So again, it's really about balance. It's about finding what works for you and what doesn't. But if you are on a quest to become a better player, join a good clan, because that's what you're going to learn. You're going to learn from those people a lot more than trying to stay where you're at.
So I would say that I would be a very bad person to actually answer the question, or at least give an answer that is helpful, because I have been in one clan. Well, I am in one clan.
Isn't
the entire
it your
time
clan?
I have ever played this game.
Oh,
nope.
Okay. I thought Pravda was yours.
Nope. But what's different for me is that I've played the game for so long that I know many of the very good players and some of the very top players. And this means that I end up divisioning with them much more often than I actually play with the clans. Not because, I have something against the clan people. It's just that I have my group of friends that I play with, and they just happen to be those people. So I think it's possible for you to simply just move on to another clan and still sometimes play with your old friends, or often play with them, because it's not like you can't do it anymore. You're just not in the same clan, but you might still be on like the same Discord, for example. So you can still chat and do all of those things. And I have thought of moving on from Pravda sometimes. However, I've figured that, it's probably not very good for me because I'm way too casual on that sense, like actually being there on time every time and whatnot. So I've just put it off for now to not move on. But I do think that if I ever moved on, I don't think people in Pravda would mind too much, because we would probably still stay in touch the exact same way as we have before. And divisioning would probably still happen in the exact same way. Sure, I wouldn't be able to play with them in clan battles, but we don't do that all that much anyway. At least I don't. I suppose Pravda does sometimes. So I would say that, you don't lose the friends that you've made when you move forward. Some of them might become upset, but I think if you try to explain it to them, they'll understand. And maybe that will make them want to improve as well. So I think just moving on is fine.
I would tend to agree, is that, unless you're like grouping with real life friends, which, I'm not sure if he is or not, but that can have different kinds of impacts. The people that in the game are generally going to be kind of transitory in your life as a whole, whereas the people that in real life, you have to be a little bit more careful about those kinds of relationships as well. Well, Aerroon, did you have anything to add here before we close out? Man, even with just the two of us, we're still over an hour. This is ridiculous.
Actually, yes. We didn't talk about the Elephant task at all.
Have at it.
But I'll sum it up. So basically, you guys have seen Mogador videos and Kleber. That Mogador is basically Kleber, except slightly worse now, I suppose. Well, I would say that a similar situation appears with the Fantask compared to the Mogador, except I think the Fantask is better than the Mogador.
So they get worse as they get higher tier? I mean, because that's if they get better as they get lower.
Pretty much. So the Fantask is slightly slower, I think, than let me pull the ships up next to one another just to make sure, because I might have checked the stats earlier without flags. So the Fantask is, she's slightly slower than the Mogador, I think. That is by a whole, what is this? 45.7 versus 44.8. So a whole 0.9 knots. But for some reason, the Fantask has 6.4 kilometry concealment, whereas the Mogador has that 7-something-ish concealment. Fantask has only 5 guns, by the way, compared to the Mogador's 8. However, the Fantask has a 6-second reload compared to Mogador's 7.5, meaning that you're behind in DPM, but it's only like 28%. You have the same torpedoes, except you have 3x3, and so one is in the middle and one is on each side, meaning that you have 6 torpedoes per side. Sure, you can't drop on both sides, but Mogador can only put out 5 of them at once now. And they're the same, 75 knots, 8 kilometer, good concealment. And she also has 13 kilometer range compared to Mogador's 12.8. And she's tier 8. So I don't know what's up with that.
I mean, both Kleber and Mogador did get adjusted. And I wonder if that's what we're seeing is Fantastic
exactly.
will get adjusted as well as we play her.
Yeah, it honestly feels that way, that either they forgot to, add in the nerfs, or they simply just haven't learned the lesson yet. Because I don't see how the ship doesn't get a similar nerf as the other two. Because I would say that Fantask is just, I don't know, you can straight up say that she's better, but I value the stats she has more than what Mogador has. Although the DPM loss is actually significant, I would say that 600 meters better concealment makes up for it. And your tier lower. Meaning that Fantask can end up with against tier 6 ships. And that's kind of a scary thought.
How does she play against the other destroyers at her tier?
Well, at her tier, she's obviously going to eat many of them alive with reload booster. However, it's kind of the same as Mogador does against tier 9 destroyers and the Kleber does against tier 10 destroyers. With reload booster, no other destroyer basically stands a chance. Without it, well, you as the French DD want to dodge. You want to dodge, because you're going to die. You're going to lose the gunfight because your DPM just isn't there without reload booster. But you'll probably have it anyway. Now, one thing though, because this is a tier 8 ship, she'll often be in tier 10 battles, meaning that the fact that you're about as strong as a Mokador is probably an advantage for you. Because enemies will be like, oh, you're a tier 8 destroyer, you're gonna be easy prey, and then you turn around and just slaughter them. And I think that's kind of cool, but I suppose it's frustrating if you're the tier 10 DD.
Alrighty, well, we're going to have a lot more about all of these ships next week, guys, as we have a chance to play them and get a little bit more in depth with them. So don't forget that we do have a new spot on the NA forums just for the Warships podcast. Be sure to check that out for news and where to ask questions of the week. Check for the link in the description. As always, follow us on Facebook at facebook.com/Warships podcast and Twitter at Warships podcast for updates between episodes. Don't forget to check out Aerroon on YouTube and Twitch as well. And don't forget that if you're in the Austin area, that you can come by and have some drinks and meet up with SubOctavian and the other Wargame staff and me this weekend at 2 p.m. on Saturday. We, of course, want to thank our amazing Patreon backers. If you're interested in supporting us, please consider becoming a backer yourself. Backers are what make the podcast possible, and we honestly could not make this podcast without you guys, so thank you very much. Take care, everyone, and we'll see you next week.